have been Christians in years past. We pray we might learn from their example. We might see what life was like and realize that your great covenant of grace extends beyond time, beyond culture, beyond our traditions. It extends to all those who call upon the name of the Lord, all those chosen by you from before the foundation of the world. We pray that you would strengthen our bonds of trust in you as we learn more about the past. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Well, today we're going to come, and I have a little outline here. We're going to come and look at the medieval church, the medieval Christianity. What was it like? You know, in most kind of history classes, you just do theology. You know, you kind of just do, what did Aquinas think? What did Anselm think? And though you need that. You need that. But I promised to you, before we started, that we would do something like this. We're going to look at what was it like, what was daily, ordinary church life, Christianity like in the Middle Ages. So as I said, we got a lot to go through. Let me give a caveat here. I'm only going to be looking in England. That's the material that I have for us today. So there's going to be variations in Italy or France or Spain. Caveat. Second caveat, the material we have, the source material we have, is mostly after 1200. Not a lot of Anglo-Saxon stuff. So you may not care about that. You may not be a big deal to you, but I wanted to be honest and mention that. So England, by the year 1300, England had 9,500 parish churches. These were your local church. You might think of them that way. We begin today looking at what kinds of churches are there, what types of churches are there. 9,500 churches by the year 1300. They were parish churches, like similar to ours. But starting in 1100, you got some newfangled types of churches popping up. First, you have what you might call royal or elite chapels. Here's the issue with a parish church. Sometimes you got to walk a lot to get there. So if you have money and you can afford to kind of maybe hire or buy a priest or a chaplain, you do that. If you have some money, you don't want to walk 3 miles to church all the time, or you're especially pious, what do? You have an elite royal chapel, a private home even. Town guilds. Let's say you're a carpenter. Let's say you're a cobbler. You make shoes. You're part of the Cobbler Guild in London. Well, you're going to have your own chapel. You're going to have the Cobblers Guild. You're going to go to your cobbler priest or the saint of Cobbler. I don't know who the saint of Cobblers is. You look him up this week and you can tell me later. The second, you'd have what they called chapels at ease. In addition to the parish church, the kind of ordinary local church, you'd have elite chapels. Or you also have chapel at ease, what we might call today a daughter church, a church plant. A certain neighborhood would have kind of a chapel at ease. And this, again, was to fill in the gaps. Not every parish church could serve every part of England, every part of the Middle Ages. And then last, I think this is the most interesting, last, you'd have just kind of your general purpose chapels. Random Christian chapels all over the place. The story goes that there was a chapel on a bridge. This has happened not infrequently. There's a chapel built right next to a bridge. You know, you cross a bridge, there's a Lovat Stovall Bridge on 85 North. You've seen the sign, right? If you're going downtown. Every time I cross it, I think of myself. Lovat Stovall, right? It's a bridge. I don't see any water, but there's a bridge there. Imagine if there was a Christian church on the side of the highway next to the bridge. That's the way it worked. Now, why would you have that? You would have that. This particular churches would be built there to get offerings to keep up the bridge. You had to maintain the bridge. It wasn't built for hundreds of years. You had to maintain it. And so one way to do it was to play on the piety, generosity of folks, and you get offerings to building a bridge. Very popular in this category would be, by the year 1200, particularly in 1300, Marian shrines to the Virgin Mary, chapels of the Virgin Mary, or a particular saint, not usually open, only open on a few feast days for the saint, during pilgrimages. What's interesting about these is that you didn't need me there. You didn't need a clergyman there. You could go in anytime you wanted to and just kind of pray there. You could just go to the bridge. You can go to the local chapel. It allowed a little bit of kind of lay authority. Now, when I say lay, I mean The clergy laid distinction in the Middle Ages and even today in some churches, looked at the pastor or the priest, the minister as high up, and everybody else as kind of beneath. We don't hold to that in the same fashion, right? But that's a whole other conversation. Now, it's important to note that in these three, not in a chapel, not in a church, you can only have what they called low mass. Distinction here. I guess it's helpful for us to know. High mass versus low mass. High mass is sung. Low mass is spoken. High mass is what we think of, perhaps, if you ever go to a Roman Catholic church on Sundays or on Easter, they will sing. It would be, of course, in Latin. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But the chapels, these kind of alternative options, you could only have low mass. They were not allowed to have baptisms, no marriages, no funerals there. So the sacraments, we'll get to those, were not allowed in these chapels. They were kind of alternative places. And if there were 9,500 parish churches, there were about 30,000, 25 to 30,000 chapels across England by the year 1300. In other words, 3 times as many chapels. Very popular, very popular. How'd you pay for them? I mean, all these churches need to be built. How do you pay for it? Well, one key way I've already alluded to, you pay for these churches through the use of guilds. You pay for a chapel. You know, if you happen to be an engineer and you belong to the Engineers Guild, well, boys would get together, the guys would get together, take up a fundraiser. They build an engineer's chapel. Congratulations, you got your own chapel. However, there were also, especially for the churches, certain obligations for the parish churches especially. I'm just going to run through this quickly here. There was what they called the church scot. I guess I should write this down for y'all. These are fun names. The church scot. That was an expected donation of grain every November 11th. What the British would come to call Armistice Day many, many years later. There was the soul scot. Payment when you wanted to bury somebody. There was the church bot. I mostly put these here so you can have the fun names, right? The church bot was given for building maintenance, right? You want to maintain the church. But there were 2 other ones. The fourth one is what they call Peter's pence, or the Rome penny. The Rome penny was a little bit given to the Pope. Now, the issue, of course, there is that you had to get it through the hands of the higher-up clergy, the bishop, the archbishop. They had to take their cut, and so it might not make it all the way to the Pope. But the big one, the big way clergy got paid, the big way churches got built was the tithe. King Edmund in the year 940 ordered all Christian men to pay 10% of their animals, and mostly animals in 940. As towns grew up, tithing became money, but generally even by 1200s, it's still mostly animals the week before Easter. In fact, today, I would expect you to have brought your animals. Have you done that? Jim, you can go grab something, one of yours, I suppose, if you need to. Tithe of grain on All Saints' Day, November 1st. By the year 1200, churches become more demanding. They want tithe from everything, wool, butter. If you hunt, I know we have hunters here occasionally. If you kill a deer, you need to give a tithe on the deer you killed in the forest. Honey from the bees, cider. Now, the reality is, of course, that not everybody paid this. Not everybody paid it. For some, that was unpopular, so they evaded it. Others who were more tender, that they asked the question, have I tithed enough? Have I given enough? Will it count against me after I die? Will I spend more time in purgatory if I haven't tithed enough? And so the practice of secret tithes emerged during Lent, during confession, to show you wanted to comply. That's a little bit about the types of churches. Let's move into more interesting things, perhaps. The church building. Any questions on any of this before we hit the church building? I'm hearing no hands being raised. So we'll go here. If you can turn, your outline, I gave you a little design, architectural design of a church building, a general church building. Churches in the Middle Ages, often named for a patron saint, often supported by a local patron, either the bishop or some wealthy guy or gal, right? They would face east. Every church would face east. Not to face Jerusalem, but because that was the ancient and universal direction. It faced east because it was believed, where Christ would come in the last judgment. The sun rise in the east, Christ is going to come from the east. New life. In fact, Christians were buried facing east, so as to rise before Christ when he appears at the last judgment. Now, there are two basic parts to the English church, a general medieval church here: the chancel and the nave. The chancel and the nave. In our church, you would call this part, I suppose, the chancel, and this part the nave. Of course, we don't use those terms. The chancel will be in the east. The nave will be in the west. East-west, I guess. The chancel is the area where the altar is. It's the area where Mass was sung. It's the area where the daily prayers, the daily office took place. It was seen as holier, more sacred than the rest of the church. The congregation was often in the nave. There was what they called a rood screen. Not rude, R-U-D-E, but R-O-O-D, rood meaning cross. A rood screen between the chancel and the nave. So you can imagine a big kind of wooden screen here with a little hole in the middle, opening in the middle. A screen, and on it you'd have pictures of Christ, the last judgment often, to remind you that when you come to church, watch out. Jesus might judge you. You'd be scared, right? You need to be aware that you're entering eternal things here, right? Eternity matters. Now, what's interesting is the nave, that is where the congregation was the place where baptism took place. It's where they preached. The pulpit, and by pulpit they just mean the lectern in those days. The pulpit would be there. Prayers would be there. If you were a laity, if you were a lay person, you'd be buried in the nave. Keep in mind, there's no carpet back in those days. In most English churches, it'd be dirt. Over time, maybe wood. Over time, maybe stone. The clergy were buried the priests were buried in the chancel, beneath the floor. Now, over time, to be fair, more and more wealthy folks got to sit in the chancel. There were seats. We have pictures of seats, images of seats that were built into the churches. You can still go visit them over in England. And so you have this division here, sharp division, but over time it gets a little blurry. I suppose the other thing to keep in mind here is that you have side chapels and side altars in the churches. So you look here on your little handout, and you're going to see there are 6 chapels on the side of this church, on either side of the chancel. There's even a lady chapel for Mary, and therefore for ladies, to go to, which became quite popular. Now, as far as seating is concerned, you would not sit by your family. Men usually would sit on the right, ladies would sit on the left, as far as we can tell. And also, by the way, you probably wouldn't sit either. You'd stand. You'd stand. Over time, seating becomes common, first for wealthy ladies, and probably assuming this for older people. By 1450, seating becomes pretty common, so most folks will be able to sit by the end of the Middle Ages in church. Churches were used not just for services, they were used for church courts. You had canon law, you had civil law. They were used for the church judicial system, teaching, probate agreements, choir practice, occasional reading schools. But most secular activities were prohibited. No games, no drinking fundraising. One of the ways that they got money in those days, they'd have a big drinking party and they'd make money from that, theoretically. Couldn't do that in church. Also, civil justice, secular courts, no. None of that took place, was supposed to take place in churches. Now, when I say prohibited, the reality is these things happened. These things happen in church, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So the final thing about the church building is that often churches would have a churchyard. That's a graveyard, as many churches in the South do today still. You know, you go to your church and there's a nice little graveyard there. And so the churchyard would be around the church. It'd be a place of burial. There was a lot of superstition attached to this. One indulgence mentions that if you say the Lord's Prayer while you pass a churchyard, you'll get as many years off your time in purgatory as there are bodies buried in that graveyard. So the next time you go by one, just try it and see what happens. The worst you can do is that you'll say the Lord's Prayer, which is a pretty good thing, right? Now, the reality is in churchyards, graveyards, there's limited space. So by 1200 roughly, what you had to do is you had to dig up old graves. They would dig up the old graves. They'd take very good care of the bones. They'd throw in new bodies into the old graves, and they'd put the old bones in a place called the charnel building, below ground level. We get our phrase charnel house from that word. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, this is a side note, ordered that the communion bread, the wine, and the holy oil be locked up to avoid magical misuse. People were coming in and just taking them and stealing them. You can't have that, apparently. Yeah, so that's the church building, generally speaking. Any questions on any of that? I'm just working through an outline here. Anything else? No. We'll come to the quotes later. Yes, we'll get to that. I mean, yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit. I mean, of course, you know about the Black Mass, Amelia? You know? Anybody know what the Black Mass is? No ex-Catholics here? Black Mass? Black Mass is still a problem today. Those who oppose the Roman Catholic Church, generally worship Satan, Satanists, kind of go in and they deliberately, eat and then spit out and pervert the host, and they call it a Black Mass. It happens. Yes? Have you done that? No.
Why do some people get buried in the name of the churchyard? Like if there were lay people that were buried in the name, okay.
Money. Or status. Actually, status also. Yeah, good question.
Churches face these because they believe that's where the direction needs to return from. What was the reason behind what was there?
Right. Great. I don't think there's anything based in the Bible about that one. Yeah, good question. Yeah. All right, moving on to congregation. Big question here. How many folks actually went to church? Popular assumption says everybody, because it was the Middle Ages, it was Christianity, it was Christendom. Reality says no. It's hard to tell. The only real solid data we have are on the 5 dates people would give offerings. 5 dates the church said you should come to church and give money, or not give money, but give your animals, give something. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the annual local church anniversary when it was built, and Candlemas. Candlemas, if we don't use that word. Candlemas, which would be February 2nd. It's cold, it's dark in England, it's snowy in England. So what happens with Candlemas? You offer a candle. It became a kind of a festival of lights, and technically, theologically, it was to celebrate Mary's purification 40 days after the birth of Christ. It was one of the 5 dates in which you're supposed to bring an offering. And we can look at the numbers there. We can tell that not everybody came every time. We can tell that there were plenty of folks who were absent. The key mass was 9 o'clock, generally 9 o'clock, sometimes 10 o'clock, Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Sunday morning. The church, of course, expected you to attend that mass every week, but the reality was quite different. So we have some nuns in Shaftesbury, 1364. They complain everybody is showing up at our early morning mass, like the 6 a.m. one. They're all showing up to get it out of the way so they can get drunk the rest of the day. And this became so common that folks called it a glutton mass. You go at 6 in the morning to get it out of the day, and then you can do your own stuff the rest of the day. They said they preferred the tavern to the church. So again, not uncommon in our day. Of course, you got to realize that the church is not just open Sunday mornings, it's open a lot during the week as well, right? So every week, every day during the week, you would have 7 different services, 7 prayers were said. This is what they call the daily office. If you know anything about Anglicanism or Catholicism, very popular among certain kind of retro traditional minded folks today. I'm not going to go through all the hours, but set at midnight, the start of the day, midnight, morning, noontime, evening, and then the end of the day. There were also 3 based upon the story of Christ, right? 7 per day, 4 around the natural cycle of the day, 3 around what happened to Christ, right? So the 6th hour, 9 a.m., the 9th hour, noon, and then at 3 o'clock, based upon what happened when Christ was convicted, put on the cross, and then dies. 9 a.m., noon, and 3. So there were a lot during the week as well. And actually, as far as we can tell, weekday services were pretty popular. You know, if you're really pious, if you care about Jesus, and the church is pretty nearby, and you go, you want to pray more, so you go to the church. There may not be there may be like the chaplain there. There may be like some guy there, not the priest, but somebody else might be there. You just go and you pray. Now, penalties for if you were regularly missing church, what would happen to you? Well, it depended who you were. If you were a shepherd, basically nothing would ever happen to you. You could miss church because it was assumed your work is essential. You have to go out and be with the sheep. So shepherds were really kind of given a free pass, as we might do maybe for essential employees today. But most everybody else might get in some amount of trouble. We have the account of a cobbler who would sell on Sundays. It was very popular for shoemakers to sell on Sundays because they would take the shoes they made during the week, show them off to everybody, because everybody would be out. They can go see them. They could be at home. They'd be available. They make a lot of money then. We have one account of a cobbler who didn't come to church. He was selling shoes. So the priest said, all right, bring your shoes to confession. He brought his shoes. The priest said, take your shoes, hold them, and then I'm going to beat you around the church. And he got beaten all the way around the church, forced to hold his shoes. That was one mostly notable punishment. Now, why would folks not attend? I've already mentioned work. Work's a major reason for the people to be absent in those days. They're plowing, they're harvesting, they're spreading their muck around. Some people are gathering acorns. We have one report of that. I don't know what that was for, but if you're hungry, I guess you're hungry. Maybe you want to feed your birds. But often, more common reasons for avoiding church that we know of. Laziness was a huge issue, particularly teenagers were notorious for sleeping in. Some things don't change. Shopping or eating was a huge distraction as well. People wanted to go. The butchers in Canterbury were a common distraction. People, they wanted to cut their meat up. People wanted to go get meat. Meat was, somewhat of a rarity then. Now, those are some reasons why you wouldn't attend. But if you did attend, what would it be like? How did you act in church? Well, it's very different than our day. You're all looking at me. You're all paying attention to some degree or another. Not so in the Middle Ages. Not really in the Middle Ages as much. There was a concept of good manners, but it was much less participatory. The Mass was much less, we're all involved. Let's say you're really devout. What do? Do you come and you really take notes in the sermon? The sermon's 10 minutes long at best, so no. Some of y'all may prefer that, right? What do you do instead? You bring a theology book. If you're wealthy, if you have a devotional book, you bring a devotional book. You bring your rosary. Rosaries become popular, right? 50 beads. 55 beads, excuse me, right? 10 every bead. You would say an Ave Maria. The 3 prayers. We'll skip a little bit here, but the 3 prayers Christians were supposed to know was the Hail Mary, the Ave Maria, the Pater Noster, Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, and then the 3rd prayer was the Apostles' Creed. They considered the creed a prayer. That's interesting, isn't it? Now, the reality is the creed was the hardest one to know, right? It was the longest, so not everybody knew that one. The Lord's Prayer kind of was the medium one, but most folks would say the Hail Mary. And so the rosary became very common by the middle to late Middle Age, 1200-ish. You'd have a rosary during church. The priest is saying stuff in Latin. You don't know Latin, so what do you say? You start saying, Hail Mary, Mother of Grace, etc., etc. And then every 10 beads, you say the Lord's Prayer on your rosary. You complete all 55 of those, 5 cycles. You say the Apostles' Creed. Catholics do this today. Still very common. Right? So this was one thing you would do during church. Now, the reality is you'd have kids running around in the graveyard outside while the church is going on. So we have bishops saying, hey, stop running around. The other reality is, in the Middle Ages, people were armed. People knew they had a right to bear arms, not guns, but daggers, bows and arrows, staffs, swords. We have a report from Yorkshire, the church in Yorkshire, that men would bring so many weapons to church and pile them up as they came in that it's hard to get inside. There were assaults that happened in church. There were 4 types of bad behavior generally. There were the restless. These are folks who come to church, and these are guys who dress to the nines. They want to walk from altar to altar during the service, and they want to show off their cool new clothes. Or, the best report we have, one guy got in trouble because he was always bringing his hawk to church on his wrist. And all the boys were like, oh, cool hawk. I guarantee you that if one of y'all brought a hawk, far more engaging than I, it was common to bring your dogs to church, birds to church. So maybe we'll see that happen in weeks to come. Who knows? But there were also folks who were gossips, right? People just chatting during church and ladies saying, oh, you look nice. Oh, no, I'm better than you, et cetera, et cetera. Guys and gals love to chatter. There were people who had fights. They loved to bring their squabbles to church with one family. They said, bam, no. Then, of course, there's resentful. You asked about a magic thing, Amelia. The story goes, not quite magical, but interesting. The story goes, there's one guy who received the holy bread from communion and immediately gave it to his dog right next to him to show contempt. Now, one big question in terms of behavior that you and I don't think about is precedence. Who has higher status? If you only have 10 chairs in the church, because most people are standing, who gets to sit in those 10 chairs? If we only had 10 or 5 chairs here, who sits in them? Well, probably the women, maybe, but which women? Who makes the list? Who makes the cut? Probably the wealthy. Good. Absolutely. They do even get one. Yes. But the issue is, what if I thought, my wife, or you thought your wife is better than somebody else's? So at one church in Kent, 4 women were dragged from their chairs. They were sitting in them. They were dragged during the middle of the service by guys who thought their own wives should sit there. It's the kind of things that happen in the Middle Ages, right? Now, I think I've already talked a little bit about prayer. One last thing on this prayer. If you said, these prayers, and you did kind of one cycle of prayers, you would get 40 days off purgatory. So it's pretty good to do that. I would, maybe encourage that if you believe in purgatory. Now, the prayers during church, well, this is the time period when kneeling became very common. In the ancient church, the posture for prayer was arms up, or palms out, like this, standing. During the Middle Ages, kneeling becomes common. Why is that? Not quite sure, but one argument is it reflects secular etiquette. In a feudal system, a feudal society, you may stand in the presence of a lord, like we do for ladies today, still a little bit, but the best way to show that you're loyal to them is you kneel before them. One knee or both knees. You show your deepest respect by kneeling or going prone on the floor. And so it began to be that in church, you did it to God. You knelt before God. Now, the word kneel in English in those days could mean brief bow, maybe like a curtsy, perhaps, like a curtsy for you, or a full descent to the knees. So that's how kneeling begins in the Christian church. The sign of the cross became even more significant. Kids would say, before they repeated the alphabet in preschool or their elementary school, they would say, Christ cross me speed. And they would make the sign of the cross, right? The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. That's how you do it, right there. There was a lot of kissing in church. The priest would kiss the altar. They'd kiss the chalice. They'd kiss the ground. you would all kiss the cross this Friday for Good Friday service. We may take that off the wall and have each of you kiss it. It'd be really medieval. We're not going to do that. Don't worry. Crying was common if you're sick or during confession. Now, the question is, how many folks actually believe this? If you're required to come to church, how many folks believe this? How pious were people? Well, it's a hard question to answer. Even though it was required, that doesn't mean you don't have real Christian piety. One evidence we have, one piece of data, are these weekday services. It's not required to go to church on Monday. So if you go to church on Monday, you must actually mean it. You must have something you want to do there. So we actually have evidence of folks coming Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, during the week. Now, the reality is there were folks who, of course, didn't agree or who created kind of superstition. Let me give you one evidence here of a superstitious plan. There was a certain prayer that circulated in England. Think of the prayer of Jabez. It was allegedly composed by St. Peter in Latin. And the idea is if you had three masses of Mary said over it, if you carried it with you, you would be able to calm storms with a water bowl. Also, you get a year off purgatory. It's one example of superstition. But unbelief was a real valid issue, particularly around communion and the question of Christ's presence in the Mass. It was a hard issue for a lot of folks. The church insisted on it above most everything else, right? Christ is really present in the bread and the wine. But it was a problem for folks. Now, most people do not express themselves in an intellectual way. If you look at your handout, look at the bottom here. The most notable example is a guy named John Knight. He was a peasant. He was a herdsman. 1441, he goes in the chapel in Newport. He takes a candle, he lights it. He goes to the statue of Mary, and he holds it under her chin. He holds it under her nose until they're black with smoke. And he says, Mabe, wear thy beard. Mary, beware your beard. Right? He makes a little black beard on Mary. It's a cute little joke, and of course he gets arrested for it. But it was fun while it lasted for him, I suppose. Example of dissent, right? It's not uncommon in their day as in ours. Any questions on any of that? I see it. Yeah, I like that. I was never good at the magic eye thing, but I think I have that. That's good, Jim. Very true. Very true. Yes, that is the case. I'm not sure we'll have time to look at clergy in detail here. Just a couple of things to note about that. You'd have a variety of clergy, not just your priest. You'd have a rector. You'd have chaplains. Chaplains were the poorest. They moved often. Rector, meaning rule over a parish. You'd have a vicar, a deputy cleric, if the parish was owned by a bishop or a cathedral. You'd be ordained. Ordination was carried out 4 times a year. Clergy had benefit of clergy. They could be tried by the church courts, not by secular courts. Let me see anything else here. There's a famous example in 1222 where the bishop comes to a local church and he has a kind of examination. He says, "Hey, priest, I have 7 of y'all. What do y'all know about the Mass?" 6 of them did not know the gospel reading for Advent, the Christmas story. They didn't know that. 1 didn't even know what the prayer of consecration in the Mass meant, which they did every week in Latin. They didn't know what it meant. Famous poem, Piers Plowman, talks about a clergyman who was better at tracking a rabbit in the field than teaching the Psalms. Many clergy were married up until 1200. Many, most, not all, were married, unlike what we typically think. Let's see here. Let's move on then briefly to the day in the week, the kind of pattern of the church and what happened during a church service, during a Mass. I've already mentioned there are seven services during each day. And most of the daily Mass involve the Psalms. In fact, every week, the priest would sing actually, all 150 psalms. So one thing that the medieval church had that we really don't have as much was a great understanding and love of the language of the Psalter. Now, Sunday was a special day. It was set apart. It was particularly holy day. Wednesday becomes a day of self-denial. Wednesday, over the years, takes on special importance. That was when Judas betrayed Christ. The belief that was when Christ started fasting in the wilderness. So Wednesday becomes the day when you want to fast. A lot of fasting happened in the Middle Ages. Saturday was also a day of prayer and fasting because that's when Mary alone, the argument went, Mary alone, after Good Friday, before Easter Sunday, on that Saturday, Mary alone believed. She was faithful. You need to be faithful too. So that was the argument. Now, the Mass itself, what's interesting is the Mass, of course, proper would be in Latin. The service of communion, the Eucharist, would be in Latin. But a lot of pieces of the service would be in English. Announcements, they would have announcements during the middle of the service. So somebody would come up here and just talk in English to you. Sermons would be in English. Sermons were about 10 to 15 minutes generally. Pretty basic. There was a complaint in 1518 that the priest had not been in the pulpit in 3 to 4 years. Right? So not only were they basic, but often skipped. Every year at Easter, there was a general confession time. Everybody would be expected to come to the priest before Easter Sunday. Easter Sunday was the one Sunday a year when everybody had to receive communion. It was your right as a Christian to get communion once a year, Easter Sunday. To prepare for that, you need to come to confession. How does confession look? You come up here. If I'm the priest, I'd be in this chair. You'd be in that chair. I'd have a hood over me because I shouldn't look at you, right? It's not the confession of the later days. There's no like big booth that you go into. You sit down, over here. People would be away from you'd be in the back of the church, so you couldn't overhear the confession, and it'd be about 20, 30 minutes. It started at 12 for girls, 14 for boys, because that was the idea when the age of maturity or discernment began. You would call the priest the ghostly father. Spiritual father, ghostly father. You can please don't try that with me. I encourage you for a variety of reasons not to use that with me. And it would take place in Lent, generally. You can do it a lot. I mean, if you wanted to, you can do it a lot. One guy, John Merck, gave a manual for giving confession for priests. He said, here's what you do. Start with belief. Do they know the creed? Do they know the 10 Commandments? Go through the 10 Commandments. Ask them, have they failed in this? Have they committed this? Go through 7 deadly sins. Then you would give penance suitable to their circumstances. This guy said, better to give a light penance that could get you into purgatory so you can work it off there after you die than a heavy one that you would never do and might send you to hell. All right, so err on the side of, be nice to people so they don't go to hell. They do a little bit of it. He said this, if the person's issue is pride, give them a penance that makes them kneel and kiss the ground. If they're a glutton, make them give money, give alms. If they're slothful, lazy, tell them to pray regularly. If they're lecherous, tell them to fast. But if they do really bad things, if they murder or steal or commit adultery, here's what you got to do. Send them to the bishop. Pass the buck. Right? And that's the advantage of having a bishop. Now, let's see here. Anything else I wanted to identify on that? Again, communion once a year at Easter. Men should shave. Don't eat food before you come there. You could have it additionally, and actually up until 1200, much more frequent for average Christians. You could have it much more often. After 1200, you needed support from a bishop or the archbishop to get it more often. There's a gal named Marjorie Kemp. She got a letter of permission from the archbishop himself of Canterbury to have communion every Sunday. It was one of the rarest of all privileges. Now, what would happen in communion, the Mass, the priest would consecrate the elements. He would consume one wafer. He would drink all the wine for himself. It was be served not in the chancel, but actually first in the nave. Eventually, it migrates to the chancel and the altar. Eventually, you'd come up as we'll do tonight. Not to the table here, but to the altar. You have two boys, two kind of little acolytes. They'd hold a long towel to catch a crumb. We don't want any part of Christ to fall to the ground. You wanted to catch the crumbs. And so folks would kneel. You kneel, and you put your chin above the towel, and the priest would put a wafer in your mouth. You couldn't touch it. In fact, somebody from London was reported to the authorities for having touched the holy wafer, the holy host. Then the person would take a sip of wine from a chalice, not the same wine that had been consecrated. This was different wine, just so you could swallow. It was not. Very clearly, the church was very clear, very different from the blood of Christ in the host. Now, the other thing is, this created issues. Because at Easter, when you've been fasting, and this is your one chance of the year usually, A, you're hungry, and B, if you're pious, you want to get communion. So what do? You bring your food. You bring your food to church to get blessed. You want your break fast, your meal to break your Easter fast to be really awesome. So you bring your meal to be blessed. But here's the issue. You're hungry. So what if after the service, you have your food with you, you just start gobbling it right down in the church, you get so sick because you haven't eaten a lot, you vomit up your food and the holy host of Jesus Christ himself. What do? So it was forbidden to eat and drink in the church. That's hard to enforce. It was on the books, but we're not sure how often that was enforced. I can go on in more details here, but very briefly, any questions on any of that? Yes, a few. Boys first.
So why can't I'm not sure that's right. Why was the blood not given to the lady?
Variety of reasons. I think one was the fear they might spill it. Chief among them. Yeah. It was one of the chief complaints of the Reformation, right? To give both parts, both elements to the people. They have a right. Yeah, good question.
Sing all of the songs.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be English or not?
A week. Yeah, and it wouldn't always be the priest. I mean, so I didn't get to this, but there's a lot of, often there were a lot of different clergy. You know, if you're in the country, you might just have one and maybe, an acolyte boy, but you could have different clergy, and they would say them. They would go to the side chapels, and they might say it, at this time or that time, and it would be in Latin. Yeah, great question. Other questions? All right, let me quickly conclude here. 6 key events in the life cycle of every medieval person, every person usually. 6 key events, 4 of them sacraments that the church had a part of: baptism, christening, confirmation, marriage, unction or anointing to those who are gravely ill, and purification of women after childbirth, which they called churching. I ran through that quickly, so I'll summarize briefly here. Baptism became on the day of birth, as was christening during then. Now you had to say, the issue became a huge issue in the church, always been an issue. What do you do if the baby's about to die? There's no priest there. The baby's about to die. What do you do? The answer is you would have the midwives say the words of christening. I have them on the handout here a little bit. They would say words like this. But the problem is, if they say the wrong words, the child goes to hell. So what you would do is you'd have all the midwives at this, emergency kind of christening or baptism. What you do is all the midwives would try to say words all at once, hoping that one of them would get them right, because not all of them, obviously knew them. Baptism took place again in the church. Normally, you'd immerse the baby you'd dunk the baby in water 3 times, something like that over there. First to the east, second to the south, third face down. So it'd be pretty fun. I don't have time to go through a lot here. Marriage took place at every age. Henry IV married at age 14. Most people, on average, the mean age for men was 29. For women, 26. So most folks married older, despite what we think of when we think of Middle Ages, kids marrying younger. Not usually the case. Let's see here. Church condemns secret marriages. I have a little poem here in the back, a little nursery rhyme. Robin, I will marry you underneath a woodland bow with a ring made of a rush because that will be good enough. Right? So marriage itself, we think of marriage today maybe as in a negative view in culture, but back then, well, people often got married, in secret if they could, if they wanted to. That's why the church was very clear. We condemn marriages not made at church. We don't prohibit them. We condemn it. You shouldn't do it, but you're married. Once you do it, you're married. And in fact, marriages were not conducted in church, but outside the door of the church. I guess last thing I'll say here. In 1200, the archbishop said that no marriage could happen unless it had been announced at church 3 times during the announcement time. So 3 weeks in a row, you announce it, the so-called marriage ban, and then officially it could be you can get married. Okay, last thing, and then I promise. Death, funeral, burial. You take place in the graveyard, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., the Requiem Mass would be said, eternal rest give them, O Lord. May light perpetual shine on them. They'd be buried in the grave. The grave is very shallow. They'd be buried in a white sheet since they've confessed their sins. They're ready to go to purgatory or heaven. They'd be laid facing eastward. There would be a cross made of wax would be put on their heart to symbolize that they died burning with charity so they can receive the prayers for the dead that will be given during the week. By the way, the prayers for the dead given during the week. So summarize it all up. The church was the place for most events in the human life. It was a place for the living. It was a place for the dead. It was a place for eternity. It was a place for the earth. It was a lookout point on a journey that would take them into another world. Any last questions or comments? That's generally semi-comprehensive look at Christianity, Middle Ages. Sure, and absolutely it was. I mean, we can look at our theology and see that God was there. Yeah. We can look at the way that they prayed, the way that they wanted to understand the Bible. I mean, they wanted to know God. It was a place where heaven and earth met. Right? We've been looking mostly at the way it worked on the earthly level. The rest of our courses are all about how it worked vis-a-vis God. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Jim, why don't you go ahead and close us in prayer?